Good evening. I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, November 23rd. And tonight, we begin with tragedy in Jerusalem, where a Canadian teen has been killed in one of two blasts, with at least 18 people injured. The first explosion occurred near a typically crowded bus stop on the edge of the city. The second went off about half an hour later near a settlement in the city's north. Police suspect the Palestinians are behind the attacks. Well, back at home, the inquiry into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act continued today. The inquiry heard the Attorney General raise the idea of using the Emergencies Act several days into their arrival in the city. David Lametti testified today that the Department of Justice started thinking about the possibility of using the legislation in late January. Mr. Lametti, who is also the Justice Minister, says he raised the idea to ensure the government was prepared for whatever action it needed to take. Ontario Provincial Police say Highway 7 has reopened today. This was after investigators spent hours combing through the scene of a deadly head-on collision east of Peterborough. OPP say the investigation continues after an SUV and pickup truck collided last night. The collision left 4 people dead and sent a 5th to hospital with life-threatening injuries. The highway was closed as police documented and reconstructed the crash scene. All right, moving to a disturbing report from Statistics Canada, which says Saskatchewan had the highest homicide rate in the country last year. Saskatchewan's homicide rate rose 9% from 2020, with 5.3 homicides reported for every 100,000 people. All right, well, meanwhile, economists say provinces such as Alberta are compounding inflation by handing out cash to help people cope with the soaring cost of living. This is according to the Senior Vice President of Public Finance at DBRS Morningstar. He says the payouts allow people to continue spending, keeping demand high and inflation from budging. His remarks come a day after Alberta Premier Danielle Smith announced a $600 payout over 6 months. This will be for each child or senior in families earning less than $180,000 a year. Alberta joins other provinces, including Newfoundland and Labrador, Quebec, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, in providing similar one-time inflation relief payouts. All right, well, on the West Coast, BC Premier David Eby is going to be introducing a new piece of legislation in the spring, which is aimed at curbing the profits of organized crime. The aim of Unexplained wealth orders is to give authorities the power to confiscate suspected proceeds of crime, seize assets, and remove the profit incentive for organized criminals. The plan is facing criticism from the BC Civil Liberties Association, which calls Unexplained wealth orders an invasive measure. It says the measure will erode the presumption of innocence. On the other side of the country in Atlantic Canada, post-tropical storm Fiona didn't cause nearly as much damage as Parks Canada had expected. At least not compared to the $40 million in damages from the 2 earlier Atlantic Canada storms. Parks Canada says a wind and rainstorm in November 2021 and a winter storm in February 2022 eclipsed the total costs of cleaning up Fiona. A statement from the agency says officials expected Fiona to cause similar damage, but the impact was nowhere near as severe as expected. Canada's Parliament unanimously passed a motion yesterday. It condemned FIFA's decision to threaten on-field punishment if World Cup players wear armbands, which are supportive of the LGBTQ plus community. Some team captains plan to wear One Love armbands in a rebuke of the human rights record of host nation Qatar, where homosexuality is criminalized. But soccer's governing bodies said wearing the armband on field could result in a yellow card. The House of Commons motion says international sport authorities have a moral obligation to support players and fans in equality against all forms of discrimination. However, FIFA did agree to allow captains to wear no discrimination armbands. Meanwhile, Canada played its first game in the World Cup since 1986. Well, despite several good chances early on, the Canadian side fell to Belgium with a score of 1-0. Canada ranked 41st in FIFA standings, and Belgium is second. Canada's next game is against Croatia on Sunday. The Canadian Pacific Holiday Train will be back in action this year for the first time since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. The train, decorated with hundreds of thousands of LED lights, will travel across the country to raise money and food donations for local food banks. The tour begins tomorrow in Lac Mégantic, Quebec, and finishes in Port Coquitlam, BC on December 18th. Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after the break with a look at holiday shopping and impulse buying. So stay tuned. We'll be back shortly. Well, with the holiday season upon us and major sales on the horizon, including Black Friday and Cyber Monday, it may be hard for many shoppers to keep track of finances. This comes as retailers boast once-a-year deals to appeal to consumers with the fear of missing out. But Elizabeth Namovsky, Vice President of Marketing at Caldwell Securities, warns that impulse shopping, especially during such tough economic times, may leave you with a mountain of debt. Well, joining us now to give us her advice when it comes to shopping this holiday season is Elizabeth Namovsky herself. Elizabeth, always great having you in Forum Daily. Welcome back.
Thank you so much, Nima. It's always good to be here with you.
Now, so many individuals live by impulse shopping, especially when it comes to big sales like Black Friday and Cyber Monday. So, what do you suggest for viewers looking to shop during the holidays without breaking the bank?
So you are 100% correct. In your intro, you talked about debt. We have never had this much debt in our lives, in our entire lives. And everyone just seems to be tapping. It's easy to tap on your credit card. And you're right. All these big sales are coming out. They're inundating us. And it's so easy to have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out. And YOLO, you only live once. So why can't I go and buy myself that really expensive piece because I deserve it? But the thing is, we've kind of been living in a bubble for the past couple of years with COVID lockdowns, people working from home. So the reality is kind of a skewed reality. And I think what we need to do for Christmas, especially, is focus on spending time with our friends and family and loved ones, because we had that taken away from us. And that, with all the lockdowns and everything, a lot of people weren't allowed to go and see their family for Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever the holiday was. And I think this is the time that we go back to basics and we deal with kindness and paying it forward and actually spending time with friends, whether you're cooking together, having a bottle of wine together, baking together, or just even watching a movie. And I think that is worth more than spending more money and going into more debt.
Some great points you bring up, Elizabeth. Now, in terms of debt and credit card debt in particular, your advice is to check your credit card statements on a monthly basis. So, how would this help people?
That's a really good question, Nima, and especially during Financial Literacy Month as well. A lot of people will look at the statement, see what the minimum payment is, pay it, and walk away. But there's a new thing called quiet spend or unconscious spending where you sign up for this new app, you give them your credit card. You sign up for another app, you give them a credit card. By the end of it all, any of these free apps that you signed up for after 3 months have expired and they all start charging you, and it all starts adding up. And I think it's really important, to take care of your money and know exactly where your money is going to. People talk about budgets and people hate budgets. They're like diets. But if you actually sit down and look at your statement, you'll know exactly where all of your money is going, where you've tapped, and whether you actually do need that extra subscription. Because I can tell you those subscriptions add up. I was listening to Kelly Keane speak, I think it was yesterday, and she said that Canadians, I believe the number was $3,000. Canadians spend $3,000 on subscriptions per year, which is a crazy amount of money.
That is a lot of money, Elizabeth. Now, in terms of dealing with credit card debt itself, you're urging people to deal with the debt credit card statements completely and not just pay minimum statements per month. So, why should people do this? How does this help them?
So we're dealing with crazy inflation right now. We are dealing with mortgage rates and interest rates going up, and things are just really out of control. So instead of paying the minimum, pay off your credit card. And the bottom line is, if you can't afford it, don't buy it. I was looking at one of my credit card statements from a long time ago, and it was $11,000. It was after my wedding. And it basically said that, I could pay $10 per month, which is the minimum. But it also says on your credit card statement, if you pay $10 per month, it will take 108 years and 9 months to pay this off. So take a look and see at where your money is going and how much you're paying on compounded interest because that $1,000 new phone might end up costing you $5 or $6,000 by the time you pay it off after your $10 a month minimum charge. So, watch, like, be very conscious of where you put your money. We all work really, really hard for our money. Let's save it and let's keep it for ourselves, especially for a rainy day.
All right, Elizabeth, always great advice. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you so much, Nima. Take care.
Stay with us. We'll be right back after the break when we're going to be taking a look at Canada and Russian energy exports. New research from secondstreet.org finds that Canada could displace about half of Russian oil and gas exports in the long term. This if it boosts production and export capacity. An interview with Colin Craig coming up next, so stay with us. The organization representing Canada's oil and gas drilling sector says it expects more activity in 2023. The Canadian Association of Energy Contractors says it expects an approximately 15% rise in wells drilled in Canada next year from this year. The industry group says it expects a boost next year from the completion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and the Coastal GasLink project, both of which will increase Canadian oil and gas capacity. Now, meanwhile, new research from a think tank suggests developing Canadian energy resources and exports could displace the global reliance on Russian energy. A secondstreet.org analysis says Canada could displace about half of Russia's energy exports over the long term. Well, with us now to discuss the study is Mr. Colin Craig, president of secondstreet.org. Mr. Craig, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
So can you tell us what the main findings of your recent report were?
Yeah, so as you noted, a lot of people are concerned with buying Russian oil and natural gas. Of course, that is one of the main funding sources for paying for Vladimir Putin's tanks and rockets that are inflicting pain on the Ukrainian people. So a lot of pundits have said, well, Canada could step up and the world could buy from Canada instead of from Russia. Then you don't have to worry about funding Putin's military. So we've heard that for a long time. We thought, well, let's see how big of a difference Canada could make. And so we asked a number of experts in the oil and gas sector just how much we could increase our output and exports if we made it a priority to build the pipelines that we need to get these resources to countries that are buying from Putin right now. And also if our country made it a priority. So those are some of the considerations they had to make when coming up with their estimates. We then took their estimates, averaged them, and compared them with future export projections for Russia to figure out how much Canada could displace in terms of Russian energy. And as you said, within the decade, we think that Canada could replace about half of Russia's crude oil exports, a little bit higher for natural gas, about 59%.
Now, that's a major dent in the energy industry, sir. Now, in terms of timeline, when it comes to boosting energy production, we know this report broke projections down into short, medium, and long-term projections. So can you unpack that for our viewers?
Yeah, so in the short term, there's not a lot that we can do. I mean, a lot of people I think will understand you can't build a pipeline overnight. It takes a long time to plan it, go through environmental approvals and so forth, even if you expedite it. So there's not a lot Canada can do within a year. Once you get into that 3 to 5 year range, if we really made it a priority, we could get into closer to around 20% of Russian energy that we could displace. And like I said, by the end of the decade, that's when we start to getting into a major dent in their exports, about half or so. So, it can't happen overnight, but I think what people need to remember is that we have a long-term problem now that we need to address. The world simply can't be buying oil and gas from Putin's regime over in the future. It's just simply not responsible to do so.
Another thing to consider here would be environmental concerns. So how can Canada boost production while also keeping within our environmental commitments?
Yeah, and that's a very good question because that is something that we need to be mindful of. And I think there's two things to consider. And one is right now, a number of countries, they're going back to coal power, which is a very dirty form of energy when it comes to emissions. And so if we actually increased the amount of natural gas that we're exporting, well, countries could use that and actually reduce their emissions by about half because natural gas is far cleaner than using coal. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Number two, governments would receive huge, huge piles of money if we started exporting more of our resources. And they could take some of those dollars to help companies that are working on technology to reduce emissions. So there's a way that we could maybe be a great ethical supplier there where we're using these dollars to figure out ways to reduce emissions overall, and that technology could be exported abroad too. So ultimately, we could help the world reduce emissions while providing the energy that it needs for the future.
Some important points to consider there, Mr. Craig. A quick 30 seconds left here, but what are the next steps for secondstreet.org following this report here?
Well, we're certainly sharing this with elected officials. I mean, at the end of the day, they have a choice if they want to step up, have our country be an ethical supplier, one that's peaceful and using the money from energy sales for good, or continue to let the world be dependent on tyrants like Vladimir Putin and other countries which have deplorable human rights track records.
Hey, Mr. Craig, thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks for your time.
All right, stay with us. We'll be right back. And up next, news from around the world, of course. So stay tuned to Forum Daily. We'll be right back after a short break. Stay with us. Well, with 6 people dead, police in Chesapeake, Virginia are trying to understand what exactly drove a shooter to open fire in a Walmart supercenter. The store manager opened fire on fellow employees as they gathered in the store's break room. It is the second high-profile mass killing in the U.S. in just a handful of days. The gunman also killed himself, and police are scrambling to find a clear motive for the shooting. Moving to Ukraine now, where authorities are reporting power outages in multiple cities. This comes after renewed strikes against the country's infrastructure facilities. Ukraine's energy ministry has said the vast majority of electricity consumers were cut off. Russia has been pounding the power grid and other facilities with missiles and exploding drones for weeks. It is seemingly aiming to turn the cold and dark of winter into a weapon. Meanwhile, the European Parliament has overwhelmingly backed a resolution labeling Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. The non-binding but symbolically significant resolution passed by a vote of 494 to 58, with 48 abstentions. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky welcomed the vote. He says Russia must be isolated at all levels and be held accountable in order to end its long-standing policy of terrorism in Ukraine and across the globe. All right, turning to an ongoing rescue mission in Indonesia, as more rescuers and volunteers have been deployed to search for the dead and missing from Monday's earthquake, which killed at least 271 people. And the toll from Java Island's magnitude 5.6 quake is likely to rise. This with many missing, more than 2,000 injured, and some remote areas still unreachable. More than 12,000 Army personnel were deployed to boost the search efforts of 2,000 police rescuers and volunteers. Videos and postings on Chinese social media say employees at the world's biggest Apple iPhone factory have been beaten and detained. This was in protests over contract disputes and antivirus controls. Videos say they were filmed at the factory in the central city of Zhengzhou. They show thousands of people in masks facing police in white protective suits with riot shields. The factory operator, Foxconn Technology Group, has said it was using closed-loop management, which refers to employees living at their workplace with no outside contact. All right, turning to central Afghanistan, where a local official says that the Taliban have lashed 3 women and 9 men in front of hundreds of spectators in a provincial sports stadium. It signaled the religious extremist group's resumption of a brutal form of punishment, which was a hallmark of their rule in the 1990s. Those being punished received between 21 and 39 lashes each. Resuming the practice has underscored the Taliban's intention of sticking to their radical interpretation of Islamic law, or Sharia. UNICEF officials say a cholera outbreak sweeping through Haiti is claiming a growing number of children amid a surge of malnutrition. The UN agency said Wednesday that the deadly combination means about 40% of cholera cases in the country now involve children. This with 9 out of 10 cases reported in areas where people are starving. Haiti's health ministry says cholera has killed more than 188 people, and it has sickened more than 10,600 others since the first deaths were reported in early October. Experts believe the number is much higher due to underreporting. All right, well, back in the U.S., former President Donald Trump has lost another high court appeal. The U.S. Supreme Court yesterday denied Mr. Trump's request to block a lower court order, which was to surrender his tax returns to the House Ways and Means Committee. The ruling means after a 3.5-year legal battle, Democrats in Congress will finally get access to Mr. Trump's tax returns. Meanwhile, Mr. Trump's longtime accountant testified yesterday that Mr. Trump reported losses on his tax returns every year for a decade. This includes $700 million in 2009. All right, well, in Germany, a senior official says that organized crime groups are likely behind the theft of a huge hoard of ancient gold coins. The coins were discovered in 1999 during excavations of an ancient settlement near the present-day town of Manching. They were stolen from a museum this week. The coins were on display at the local Celtic and Roman Museum, and authorities fear the treasure, worth millions of dollars, could be melted down. The American holiday travel rush is already on, and it could spread out over more days than usual this year. Travel experts say the ability of many people to work online and remotely is letting them take off early for tomorrow's U.S. Thanksgiving holiday or return home later. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.